The persistent belief that emotional experience possesses inherent meaning arises from a fundamental misunderstanding. It is a framework within which we navigate feeling, and it proves remarkably tenacious. This assumption dictates that a particular emotional state is in itself a significant and self-contained entity. It suggests that sadness, for example, is something that, rather than something that occurs something. This view gains traction because of readily observed correlations. A loss generates grief. An insult provokes anger. These sequences appear linear, suggesting a direct causal link between circumstance and emotional response. The presence of external stimuli seems to confirm the internal validity of the feeling itself. We name the feeling, and the name appears to capture its essence. The physiological data further reinforces this perception. Measurable changes occur within the body during emotional experiences. Heart rate increases, respiration alters, skin conductance shifts. These physical manifestations lend weight to the conviction that the emotional state possesses an objective, tangible reality. Societal validation adds another layer of support. Expressions of emotion are recognized, categorized, and often deemed appropriate or inappropriate within established cultural norms. The entire structure appears robust and self-evident. However, the examination of individual variability undermines this presumption. Consider two individuals exposed to an identical circumstance, the news of a friend's illness, for example. One person may experience profound sadness, while another feels a muted concern. A third person may register the news with detached intellectual analysis, devoid of overt emotional response. The divergence is not due to inherent differences in the circumstance itself, but rather in the ways each person interprets and attributes significance to it. The meaning is not residing within the event, it is being projected onto it. The sadness, the concern, the detachment, these are not intrinsic qualities of the friend's illness, but rather representations crafted by individual minds. The correlation, which initially appeared to demonstrate causality, is, in fact, a testament to the subjective attribution of meaning. What is observed is a response, but the response is not inherently determined. It arises from a complex interplay of past experiences, current perspectives, and anticipatory projections. The framework of inherent meaning is a construction. The insistence on intrinsic meaning is a convenient simplification. It permits navigation of social interactions. It facilitates communication and allows for shared understanding. Yet it is just that, a simplification. It closes off other avenues of response. It restricts the field of perception. The very act of labeling an emotion, of assigning it a fixed and immutable meaning, diminishes the fluidity of the experience. The experience itself is transient, a momentary confluence of conditions, yet the attribution imposes a static quality. The structure of inherent meaning loses its foundation when considered as a projection. The initial certainty dissolves. What remains is the simple fact of feeling. The feeling exists. The assumption that emotional response originates solely from external stimulus holds considerable apparent weight. It exists as a framework within which experience is commonly understood. An event occurs, a feeling arises. This sequence seems straightforward, logical, and directly causal. The perception of this connection is immediate and pervasive. It forms a foundational structure for interpreting interactions with the world. The reliance on this perspective is deeply ingrained. Explanations for emotional states frequently refer to external factors. Discomfort is attributed to a specific action, joy to a particular circumstance. Validation for feeling is sought in identifying the triggering event. This external attribution provides a readily available narrative, a tangible source for an intangible sensation. The assumption offers a seemingly secure point of reference. Consider a situation. A verbal remark is made. Subsequently, a feeling of frustration emerges. The immediate inclination is to assign the frustration to the remark itself. The remark is identified as the direct cause, the originating point of the emotional response. This attribution feels correct, given the temporal proximity of the events. The explanation satisfies a need for understanding. However, this apparent connection warrants closer observation. An examination of the events preceding the feeling reveals a more complex interplay. Prior expectations existed regarding communication, social interaction, and appropriate language. Preconceived notions about the speaker's intent were present. Unarticulated beliefs about fairness and respect were engaged. These internal elements are not external stimuli. They are internal constructs, existing prior to and independently of the observed remark. These elements modify, shape, and significantly contribute to the resultant feeling. The remark alone does not create frustration. The internal landscape, constituted by prior expectations and beliefs, interacts with the external stimulus. This interaction generates the felt emotional response. The assumption that the remark is the sole origin of the frustration is therefore incomplete. It excludes a vital component of the process. It overlooks the internal conditioning that mediates the experience. Observe, too, the narratives that accompany the feeling. Thoughts arise, justifying the frustration, amplifying its intensity, or attempting to contextualize it. These narratives are not responses to the remark, they are reflections on the feeling itself. These reflections further demonstrate the role of internal processes. They are internal constructions arising alongside the feeling, not derived solely from the external event. The perceived connection between stimulus and response is therefore conditional. It is dependent on the existing framework of internal expectations and beliefs. When the felt response deviates from these expectations, the apparent connection weakens. When the internal framework shifts, the same external stimulus may elicit a different response. The solidity of the initial assumption begins to dissolve. The causal link appears less direct, less inevitable. The reliance on external factors as the sole determinant of emotional response diminishes. The assumption's initial apparent weight dissolves into a recognition of its conditional nature. Experience is understood as a composite of internal and external processes. The sense of experiencing arises within a framework. It is a feeling, a shift in internal state, an alteration of physiology. It is immediately categorized. The categorization happens rapidly, almost without conscious registration. Then it is assigned a relationship to something else. It is mine. It belongs to me. This attribution occurs swiftly, almost reflexively. This assignment presupposes a consistent entity to which the feeling belongs. The feeling, whatever its precise quality, becomes data for that entity. It is evidence of its existence, its state. It reinforces the perceived continuity of that entity across time and experience. The feeling is interpreted through the lens of this already established perspective. This perspective is largely linguistic. Language provides a structure for articulating experience. It emphasizes a first-person designation. The pronoun I serves as a focal point. Possessive markers extend this focus. My anger, my joy, my fear. These constructions inherently imply a possessor, a permanent locus of ownership. The language itself reinforces the assumption. Consider the sheer volume of communication reliant upon this structure. Everyday interactions are built upon the premise of a distinct individual possessing specific emotions. The entire architecture of social exchange leans upon the solidity of this assumed self. Dissociation from this assumption is, therefore, difficult. It requires a disruption of habitual patterns. Yet the content of emotional states is demonstrably unstable. Feelings emerge and dissipate. They intensify and diminish. They transform unexpectedly. Anger shifts to frustration, then to resignation. Joy curdles into anxiety, then fades into neutrality. These fluctuations are intrinsic to the nature of feeling. They are not aberrations, they are the norm. The assumed entity, the I, to which these feelings are attributed, remains unchanged across these transitions only as a conceptual construct. It is an interpretation, a label applied to a ceaselessly evolving process. The feeling itself is not a demonstration of a permanent self, but an illustration of impermanence. The attachment to feeling is an attachment to an illusion. The feeling arises, it passes. The language attempts to contain it, to solidify it, to claim it as belonging. It does not. The feeling is simply a phenomenon, an occurrence within a field of conditions. The insistence upon ownership obscures this simple truth. It solidifies the illusion. It perpetuates the suffering that arises from clinging to a phantom. The feeling ceases, leaving only the framework. The perception of emotional release as resolution is a common one. It operates as a foundational belief in how distress is managed. This belief suggests that the alleviation of an unpleasant feeling signifies the ending of an issue. A reduction in subjective discomfort is taken as conclusive evidence of a problem resolved. The seeming validity of this perception rests on the desirability of feeling better. The cessation of pain, whether physical or emotional, is naturally sought. That a feeling diminishes confirms its previous existence, providing a sense of closure. This reinforces the notion that emotional release represents a complete ending. Cultural trends contribute to this understanding. There is encouragement to express emotions, to articulate internal states. Feeling is often considered synonymous with being authentic or being genuine. Pleasure is presented as a desirable state, and its pursuit is implicitly encouraged. These external pressures normalize the expectation of emotional reduction as a worthwhile goal. Consider the effort involved in seeking such release. Actions are undertaken, words are spoken, often with the explicit intention of diminishing an unwanted feeling. However, the very act of striving for relief frequently generates further instances of craving. The desire for absence becomes its own source of discontent. This pattern is not random. It is a direct consequence of identifying release with resolution. When a feeling is perceived as a problem needing eradication, the pursuit of its removal creates a dependency. The absence of the feeling becomes a condition for happiness. The feeling's return, inevitable as it is, triggers renewed dissatisfaction. The initial discomfort, the impetus for seeking release, is then compounded by the frustration of unmet expectations. The cycle of craving expands, encompassing not only the original emotion, but also the desire to avoid its recurrence. This perpetuation contradicts the assumed resolution. It demonstrates an ongoing, rather than a conclusive, state. This expectation is contingent upon a prior assumption that feelings are things to be eliminated. It presumes that absence of subjective experience equates to resolution. This presumption dictates the actions taken and the evaluation of their outcome. The expectation collapses. It is simply that the belief that emotional narratives offer an objective representation of reality is a pervasive structure of thought. This assumption operates as a foundational element in how individuals interpret experience. The narratives themselves provide a readily available framework. They organize events, assign consequence, and propose explanations for what has transpired. This structure proves immediately useful. It simplifies complex encounters into digestible sequences. The utility of these narratives fuels their perceived validity. They offer predictability, a scaffolding against the apparent chaos of existence. To encounter an event is to instinctively seek placement within a pre-existing narrative. This placement delivers a sense of coherence, even if superficial. Discomfort arises when experiences resist assimilation into established frameworks. Such resistance is often characterized as confusion or distress. The reinforcement of shared narratives further contributes to their apparent veracity. Social interaction consistently validates particular narrative constructions. Agreement between individuals strengthens a sense of truth. Divergent accounts are often challenged, marginalized, or dismissed. This social pressure further constricts the boundaries of acceptable representation. It solidifies the narrative's grip upon perception. The validity of a narrative rests upon its selective nature. No narrative encompasses all aspects of an event. It necessarily includes certain elements while excluding others. This selection is not random. It is motivated by the narrative's purpose, to deliver a particular meaning. A narrative focused on responsibility, for instance, will emphasize the actions of a specific actor. A narrative focused on circumstance will minimize the role of agency. These choices dictate the final presentation. Consider a commonplace interaction. Two individuals experience the same occurrence. Each constructs a narrative to explain that occurrence. The narratives will differ. One individual may emphasize the positive qualities of another's behavior. The other may focus upon perceived failings. Both accounts pertain to the same event, yet they portray drastically different realities. The difference resides not in the event itself, but in the selective construction of the narratives. The narratives do not reflect reality, they shape it. The shape is imposed upon the flow of experience. This imposed shape generates a sense of order, but that order is artificial. It is a construct reliant on continuous maintenance. Dissatisfaction arises when the imposed shape conflicts with the inherent dynamism of experience. The effort to reconcile the two creates tension. The reliance on narrative as a source of truth introduces a fundamental limitation. The narratives are contingent. They depend on the availability of particular words, concepts, and memories. The absence of any of these elements can destabilize the narrative. A shift in perspective, a new piece of information, can trigger a reconstruction. What appeared solid dissolves. The assumed objectivity of emotional narratives is therefore revealed as a conditional construct. The narratives are not windows onto reality, but rather frames placed before it. The frame dictates what can be seen and how it is seen. The attempt to mistake the frame for the landscape is an error of perception. The structure itself is the limitation. The framework collapses. The sensation presents itself, and the conclusion follows swiftly. There is a felt state, a physiological shift, a pattern of internal chemistry. The immediate assignment is self. It is not merely felt self, it's self. This equation, this automatic linkage, constitutes a foundational error. The experience is undeniable. The tightening in the chest, the accelerated pulse, the alteration of perception, these are real occurrences. To deny them would be inaccurate. The mistake lies in the subsequent assertion that these occurrences define a permanent, inherent characteristic. To be angry, for instance, is frequently stated as a declaration of being. The word I attaches itself to the felt condition, solidifying a presumed connection. This presumed connection generates consequence. It dictates how the experience is navigated. If anger is understood as a core component of self, resistance to its presence becomes logical. Attempts to suppress, to control, to justify, these arise from a perceived threat to established identity. The felt state, then, is not merely experienced, it is baffled. The intensity of the experience amplifies. The act of resistance, the struggle against what is deemed intrinsic, fuels the very phenomenon one seeks to diminish. The physiological shifts become more pronounced. The alteration of perception deepens. The duration stretches. Identification, in this sense, acts as a catalyst. It does not lessen the experience, it strengthens it. The assumption appears validated by its immediate accessibility. The subjective experience undeniably feels intimately linked to the individual. It registers as a truth, a certainty. Yet, careful observation reveals the conditional nature of this perceived truth. The identification itself is a construction, a conceptual overlay imposed upon raw sensory data. It is a labeling process, not a revelation. The persistence of the equation obscures the originating conditions. Focusing on the label, "I am angry," diverts attention from the antecedent factors that triggered the physiological shift. The causes remain unexamined, the patterns unobserved, the influences unexplored. The focus narrows to the perceived self, the supposed owner of the emotion. This narrowing serves only to reinforce the initial erroneous assumption. Furthermore, the linkage establishes a framework for future occurrences. Each subsequent episode becomes further embedded in the established pattern. The felt state is not simply experienced anew, it is re-experienced within the pre-existing narrative of self. The narrative strengthens, and the perception of inherent connection solidifies. The initial clarity, the feeling of understanding, dissolves upon closer inspection. What remains is not a deepening of comprehension, but a heightened awareness of the conditional nature of the construction. The perceived connection, the assumed identity, is revealed as a framework, a conceptual imposition. The felt state exists, but the equation collapses. The sensation remains, but it is no longer tethered to a presumed self. The self, as understood, is no longer present. The structure disappears. It was always a structure. The pursuit of well-being is frequently predicated upon the maintenance of a consistent self-image. This expectation seems logical on the surface. A recognizable identity, a sense of continuity in feeling and behavior, appears to offer a foundation for security. The accumulation of experiences becomes interpretable within a frame of reference. Actions can be justified as extensions of a known character. This provides a baseline expectation for how the world will respond and how one will respond in return. The perceived validity of this assumption stems from the comfort derived from predictability. Life presents inherent uncertainties. A consistent self-image acts as an anchor against these fluctuations. It allows for a limited range of responses, a manageable degree of anticipation. The effort required to navigate complex situations is lessened when one believes oneself to be fundamentally stable. This belief is also reinforced by social systems. Interactions within established communities demand recognizable patterns. Deviations from expected behavior invite scrutiny and potential ostracization. Social rewards, recognition, and advancement are often linked to adherence to prescribed roles and presentations. Individuals who consistently embody a particular image are therefore more likely to gain acceptance and access resources. This does not necessarily indicate a causal relationship, but the correlation is frequently observed. However, the rigidity inherent in a maintained self-image becomes a source of distress. The demand to remain consistent fosters an internal pressure. Any event that challenges this image, any circumstance that demands a response outside of the established pattern, creates resistance. An emotional reaction to an external situation might be interpreted as a failure of the self, a disruption of the expected continuity. This triggers a defensive mechanism, an effort to reassert the desired image. The insistence on maintaining a certain perception of oneself demands constant surveillance. Thoughts and actions are filtered through the lens of this image. Authentic impulses may be suppressed, spontaneous responses are curtailed. A discrepancy between the perceived self and the actual self generates discomfort. The individual becomes preoccupied with preserving the illusion of consistency. This pursuit of consistency consumes energy. It limits the capacity to adapt. It diminishes the potential for genuine connection. The world is in constant flux. Holding on to a fixed self-image necessitates a denial of this fundamental truth. The individual creates an internal friction between the self and the reality. The appearance of continuity is itself conditional. It is dependent on memory, on narrative construction, on the selective interpretation of experience. Memory is fallible. Narratives are constructed, not inherent. The self-image is a provisional arrangement of beliefs and behaviors, not an immutable essence. Its validity rests on the assumption that the external world will remain accommodating, a premise that is demonstrably false. The emotional distress resulting from the inability to maintain this image is proportionate to the investment in its preservation. The more crucial the self-image appears to be to one's sense of well-being, the more severe the consequences of its disruption. The very need to safeguard the image implies its fragility. The foundation upon which this assumption rests simply dissolves when subjected to observation. The feeling arises. It is experienced as a direct consequence of something perceived. The perception registers and the feeling follows. This sequence appears inherent, a seamless transition from external event to internal state. It seems, at first glance, to be the natural order of things. Consider the event a perceived slight, a harsh word, a missed opportunity. The subsequent feeling, anger or disappointment, is often accepted as the inevitable outcome. This is a common understanding. It reinforces the sense of being at the mercy of circumstances, of being swept away by forces beyond control. Dissatisfaction arises from this perceived helplessness. The feeling is not, however, an immediate response. There is a space between the stimulus and the reaction, a space that is usually unexamined. It is within this space that the misunderstanding resides. The feeling does not originate solely from the external stimulus itself. It arises from a confluence of factors that precede and shape the response. These factors are patterns of thought. They are learned associations. They are beliefs held about the world and one's place within it. A perceived slight, for example, evokes anger not simply because the words were spoken, but because those words are interpreted through a pre-existing framework of expectations and values. A prior belief about fairness, about respect, about deservedness colors the perception and precipitates the feeling. The framework itself is not spontaneously generated, it has been constructed over time. It is the accumulation of past experiences, absorbed narratives, and internalized cultural norms. This accumulated structure acts as a lens, distorting the immediate perception and coloring the subsequent emotional reaction. The feeling is not a spontaneous outburst, but a predictable consequence of an established system. The perceived immediacy obscures the underlying architecture. The experience itself is compelling, drawing attention to the feeling and away from its conditioning. The intensity of the feeling reinforces the mistaken assumption that it is an unavoidable response. The feeling shouts, and the preceding thoughts remain silent. The reaction appears spontaneous because the conditioning is largely unnoticed. It operates beneath the surface of conscious awareness, exerting its influence without recognition. The feeling feels direct, but it is in fact filtered through layers of prior conditioning. The belief system is foundational. The feeling is its expression. The feeling itself does not disappear when the stimulus is removed. It lingers, a remnant of the conditioned response. The expectation remains, primed to react to similar stimuli in the future. The cycle perpetuates, reinforcing the illusion of inevitability. The feeling is then a demonstration of an invisible architecture. The experience of being overwhelmed by feelings is itself a product of this misunderstanding. To perceive a feeling as a force, as something that one, is to perpetuate the cycle. To acknowledge the preceding thoughts and beliefs, to trace the structure that shapes the response, is to reveal its conditional nature. The feeling diminishes when the source of its formation becomes clear. The reaction is not a given, but a construction. It is entirely dependent upon the existing foundation. It ceases to be absolute. The belief persists that what happens determines how one feels. A perceived sequence exists, an event occurs, and subsequently a corresponding emotional state arises. This view shapes understanding. It offers a framework for predicting and explaining reactions. Suffering frequently accompanies this assumption. Disappointment, anger, or grief are readily linked to specific circumstances, creating an apparent correspondence. The narrative is simple. External triggers produce internal responses. This structure presents a readily accessible explanation for distress. When encountering difficulties, identifying a preceding event appears to provide clarity. It seems logical to assume that sadness follows loss, that frustration emerges from obstacles. The sequence is easily repeatable. One can recall countless examples aligning with this established pattern. The perceived causality reinforces the belief in its inherent validity. However, the assumed linearity falters upon closer observation. Individuals exposed to similar events do not invariably experience identical emotional outcomes. What might provoke intense sadness in one person evokes mild discomfort in another. The variation is undeniable. The direct causal link is not universally consistent. The simple sequence is not absolute. The variation signals the presence of factors beyond the observed event. These factors are not immediately apparent, nor are they easily categorized. The events themselves are not the sole determinant of emotional state. It is the association of the event with other unexamined elements that produces the resultant feeling. This association is not uniform. It is unique to each experience, each individual. The appearance of causality relies on a simplification. Attributing emotional states to external occurrences offers a convenient resolution. It bypasses the complexities inherent in subjective experience. This simplification, however, obscures the intricate relationship between what occurs and how one perceives it. The perceived link is a construct, not a fixed reality. The very premise of a direct, predictable connection begins to unravel. The perceived relationship between event and feeling is contingent. It rests on the assumption that external circumstance alone dictates internal state. This assumption proves unsustainable when confronted with the demonstrable diversity of emotional responses. The expectation of linearity dissolves. The connection is conditional. The sense of acting emerges alongside emotional response. A sensation arises, and a corresponding action follows. The sequence appears self-generated, originating from within the experience itself. The immediacy of this linkage establishes a perception of agency. It seems that feeling dictates action, that the experience is the source of the movement. This impression strengthens as the emotional state intensifies. The intensity obscures a broader context. Attention narrows to the immediate sensation, to the force felt within the body. This focus reinforces the idea of a self-contained origin. There is no consideration of prior conditions, of the factors contributing to the emotional state. The body reacts, the mind responds. The reaction and the response are considered unified. They appear to be the product of a singular internal source. This perceived unity creates the impression of control. The feeling of being driven, of being compelled, seems to indicate a power residing within the emotional state itself. The action is presented as a consequence of this perceived power. Dissatisfaction arises when the action produces unintended results. The results are perceived as failures of this power, as limitations on agency. The frustration is directed toward the originating sensation, toward the feeling that instigated the action. However, the sequence is not random. Repeated observation reveals predictable patterns. Certain sensations consistently trigger specific actions. External stimuli reliably produce specific internal states. The intensity of the feeling does not alter these patterns. The seeming power remains consistent in its operation. Analysis does not uncover an originator. It reveals instead a relationship, a sequence of events. The perceived compulsion remains consistent across different circumstances. When encountering a familiar stimulus, the reaction is almost identical. Differences exist, but they are variations within a framework. They are deviations from a standard pattern, not a disruption of its foundations. These variations are also predictable, related to other influencing factors. There is no spontaneous, unprecedented response. The feeling of being driven is an interpretation of this predictable sequence. The interpretation attributes agency to the sensation. It creates the illusion of a source, a point of origination. The intensity of the feeling amplifies the illusion. The apparent force of the response reinforces the perception of control. The observation of consistent patterns contradicts the assumption of a singular, originating power. The sequence simply unfolds. The assumption of agency is therefore dependent on this interpretation. It is not inherent in the sequence of events. The interpretation is a mental construct, a way of understanding the relationship between sensation and action. The construct is maintained by consistent focus, by attending to the immediacy of the experience. Without this focus, the sequence appears as a chain of events, each conditioned by the last. The feeling of being driven diminishes. The perception of a separate, acting entity fades. The sense of acting dissolves into the ongoing flow of experience. The assumption that emotional intensity correlates with the magnitude of an issue is a persistent framework. It functions as an internal guide, informing how experience is categorized and prioritized. When an emotion arises, anger, grief, anxiety, the immediate inclination is often to assess the gravity of the situation that purportedly generated it. A surge of sadness is presumed to reflect a significant loss. A wave of frustration indicates a substantial obstacle. This assignment of scale feels instinctively correct. It is consistent with observable patterns. Powerful events typically elicit powerful responses. A bereavement is marked by intense sorrow, a betrayal by intense rage, a perceived failure by intense disappointment. The visible link reinforces the underlying belief. This perception is not merely individual. Cultural systems routinely validate and even encourage displays of intense emotion. Expressions of grief are sanctioned, anger is sometimes deemed justifiable, and vulnerability is often presented as admirable. Public narratives reinforce the connection. Dramatic depictions highlight the parallel between profound circumstance and correspondingly profound feeling. The reinforcement loops back on itself, strengthening the association. A person experiencing little outward distress in the face of adversity might be perceived as detached or even callous. Conversely, demonstrative displays of emotion are frequently interpreted as confirmation of a serious situation. However, repeated observation reveals discrepancies. Emotional intensity is frequently disconnected from demonstrable magnitude. A minor disagreement might trigger disproportionate anger. A fleeting insecurity can produce a paralyzing anxiety. An imagined slight can elicit a torrent of resentment. These instances do not invalidate the initial observation. They challenge the direct proportionality. They suggest that the relationship between feeling and circumstance is not the absolute value it appears to be. An emotion's intensity does not reliably signal the significance of its triggering event. The framework continues to operate, regardless. The assignment of scale persists even when challenged by experience. The expectation remains that intensity represents magnitude, that a strong feeling indicates a serious problem. Discrepancies are often rationalized, explained away as exceptional cases, or simply ignored. The system resists direct interrogation. It is self-sustaining through repetition and cultural validation. It functions as a default setting, a lens through which experience is processed. It is a framework built on a foundational assumption. The assumption, however, does not possess inherent validity. It is a construction, a learned interpretation. It does not exist independently of the act of interpretation itself. The perceived link between emotional intensity and the magnitude of an issue is a contingent proposition, subject to alteration and dissolution. Its dissolution does not negate experience, but merely removes a layer of presumptive significance. The emotional response simply occurs. It does not necessitate an evaluation of its source or severity. The intensity itself holds no information. It remains a structure we built. The sense of being a self, a continuous entity, frequently arises from the accumulation of emotional narratives. These narratives coalesce around significant experiences, forming a perceived trajectory through time. The feeling of me becomes bound to a sequence of remembered joys, sorrows, triumphs, and disappointments. This perceived consistency provides a framework for understanding the internal landscape. This framework is not inherently false. It functions effectively in social contexts. Interactions rely on predictable responses, on the ability to anticipate actions based on perceived history. Shared narratives allow for this predictability. A shared understanding of grief, for example, permits empathetic engagement. A shared understanding of accomplishment allows for expressions of praise. These narratives facilitate communication and build bridges between individuals. However, the validity of these narratives as representations of a stable self is questionable. Examination reveals a remarkable fluidity within them. Consider a childhood memory of shame. Its significance, its emotional intensity, changes dramatically over decades. The same event, revisited through different lenses of experience, offers alternative interpretations. The individual who once felt deeply humiliated may later view the incident with amusement or with a sense of detached pity. The emotional coloring shifts. The narrative itself restructures. This restructuring is not aberrant behavior. It is a constant process. Experiences initially perceived as traumatic may, with the passage of time, be reframed as formative challenges. Moments of intense joy can be recontextualized as fleeting pleasures. Each reinterpretation alters the perceived sequence, disrupting the idea of a fixed and consistent emotional record. The narrative changes because the observer changes. The feeling of self, therefore, is not anchored to a bedrock of immutable experience. It is constructed from shifting sands. Each retelling alters the foundation. Each new perspective introduces a modification. The narrative is a performance, continually revised and adapted. The audience, in this case, is the self, viewing a story it simultaneously creates and observes. The assumption that emotional narratives define a consistent self generates dissatisfaction. The discrepancy between the perceived self and the fluid reality of experience creates a tension. The longing for stability, for a fixed point of reference, is intensified by the very framework designed to provide it. Attempts to maintain this illusion of consistency lead to resistance when narratives inevitably shift. These attempts generate frustration and a sense of alienation. The persistence of this error stems from the social utility of shared narratives. Maintaining the illusion of a consistent self allows for smoother social interactions. Deviations from accepted narratives can invite judgment or exclusion. A refusal to subscribe to a shared understanding of loss, for instance, might be perceived as callousness. The pressure to conform to expected narratives reinforces the mistaken assumption, perpetuating the cycle of dissatisfaction. The narratives themselves have no intrinsic truth. They are provisional constructs, useful for navigating a complex world, but ultimately unreliable indicators of a stable identity. The feeling of being a self, built upon these narratives, dissolves when the narratives are recognized as transient and changeable. The notion of a consistent identity defined by emotional narratives simply ceases to exist. The impulse to name an emotion feels definitive. To declare sadness, anger, or joy is to believe the declaration contains the experience itself. This conviction functions as a practical tool. Labels serve as a form of communication, enabling swift conveyance of internal states. They permit categorization, grouping similar feelings under shared designations. The structure of language fundamentally prioritizes such categorization and definition. To name is to place is to delineate. This system appears functional, and indeed it serves a purpose. Without labels, interpersonal understanding would be considerably more laborious. Shared vocabulary facilitates social cohesion. A request for assistance, a warning of danger, these require a degree of pre-established understanding. Emotional labels contribute to that shared foundation. Yet, this utility does not equate to truth. The process of labeling abstracts. It extracts a feature from a broader sensory and cognitive field. The declared emotion represents a simplification. It is a fraction of a constantly shifting reality. The experience itself involves physiological responses, sensory input, cognitive appraisals, and prior conditioning. These elements interact in an intricate web. To isolate one aspect and assign it a name is to overlook the interconnectedness. Dissatisfaction arises from this oversight. When a label is mistaken for the totality of an experience, expectations form. The named emotion dictates subsequent action, anticipates future occurrences, and demands recognition from others. This demand creates a dependency. The individual seeks validation through the continued affirmation of the label. A shift in feeling, a subtle change in circumstance can disrupt this expectation. The resulting discrepancy generates a sense of incongruence, a feeling of something being amiss. The perceived accuracy of labeling relies on a specific condition. That condition is the assumption that a name can fully represent experience. This assumption is perpetuated by the language structures used to communicate. Language itself operates according to principles of categorization and definition. It is a system designed to create boundaries, and boundaries are inherently limiting. They establish a distinction where one may not exist, or more accurately, where distinctions are constantly dissolving. Consider the word fear. The physiological response, increased heart rate, constricted breathing, may be present. Cognitive evaluations, assessment of potential threat certainly contribute. But the feeling itself is not the label. The label is a shorthand, a convenient means of referring to a complex combination of factors. To equate the label with the process is to diminish the complexity. The usefulness of the label does not guarantee its validity as a complete description. The utility derives from its ability to communicate, while its apparent truth is based on a conditional assumption. The assumption can be observed and then released. The practice of naming emotions does not cease, it simply loses its grip on perceived reality. The declaration itself remains a construct, a framework built to facilitate understanding, not to contain it. It remains a description, not the thing described. It is possible to acknowledge the convenience of labeling while recognizing that the assigned name has no bearing on the underlying, ever-changing experience. It is simply a name. The feeling presents itself as a singular event. It is understood as an indivisible whole. The subjective experience of sorrow, for example, appears as a unified phenomenon. Its arrival feels absolute, its duration continuous. This perceived unity generates a foundational error. It is the error of assuming that sensation and its subsequent interpretation are intrinsically linked. The error arises from the immediate nature of experience. We do not typically perceive a gap between the initial physiological response and the subsequent cognitive process. A sudden noise prompts a flinch. This flinch is accompanied by a perception of alarm. The sequence occurs so rapidly, it registers as a single integrated event. This seamlessness creates the illusion of inseparability. Consider the physiological response to a perceived threat. The heart rate increases, muscle tension arises, breathing becomes more rapid. These are detectable physiological changes. They are not the emotion itself, but are regularly conflated with it. The cognitive appraisal then assigns meaning to these physiological signals. The appraisal labels the sensations as fear or anxiety or anger. This labeling contributes to the perceived unity. The error reinforces itself through repeated patterns. Every episode of emotional experience solidifies the belief in their inherent connection. Each instance confirms the notion that sensation and interpretation are two aspects of a single, indivisible entity. This reinforces a habitual understanding, preventing deeper investigation. The feeling of sorrow, for instance, becomes indistinguishable from the awareness of being sorrowful. It is the act of labeling that obscures the distinction. The label implies a causal link where one may not exist. To say, "I am angry," suggests anger is a fundamental property of the self. It suggests anger is an inherent state. This contributes to the sense of an enduring, unified experience. The physiological change does not require the interpretive label to exist. The label, however, requires the physiological change to be present. The assumption creates a ground for suffering. Recognizing the feeling as an inherent characteristic creates attachment. Attachment to an emotion solidifies the feeling's perceived reality. This produces dissatisfaction when the feeling is undesirable. Dissatisfaction arises from the futile attempt to permanently alter what is perceived as a unified state. The effort to eliminate sadness, for example, is an attempt to eliminate a fundamental aspect of the self. The perceived unity is conditional. It is a product of rapid succession and habitual interpretation. The sensation and the subsequent appraisal are discrete events occurring in sequence. They are not bound together by an inherent, unbreakable connection. One can observe the physiological response without attaching a particular label. The absence of the label does not negate the physiological response. The absence of the physiological response does not negate the possibility of an interpretive label. The assumption dissolves upon examination. It reveals itself as a construction of the mind. The feeling ceases to be a singular, unified phenomenon. It becomes a sequence of events, separable in origin and essence. Understanding this alters the perception of emotional experience. The distinction remains.